Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Geo Bond Town Hall. For those who are not on the island, the Duke Energy siren test just went off, so thank you for your patience. Okay, I'm just going to go over the meeting format real quickly. Our meeting is via Zoom, and we're going to be able to see online the audio and video of the presentation. All meeting participants will be muted when entering. A brief presentation and a short Q&A period afterward. The in-person meeting attendees will be given the opportunity to ask questions first, and the virtual attendees can ask questions using the email, vbhitransportation@villagebhi.org. Those questions will be placed in queue in the order that they're received.
Aaron, I'm hearing there's a little bit of echo. If there's another source on in the road.
I'm going to turn my phone off. I think that was it.
Okay. Yep, me. Yep. Okay, this is Andy Sayer. Good morning. Thank you for attending our second forum on the village's proposed purchase of the island's transportation system. There are many moving parts that challenge easy understanding. Hopefully we can offer some clarity. We also want to dispel some of the misinformation being spread. The first mistruth is that the village staff and council represent only the voters. This is not true. Your village staff and elected council people take very seriously the responsibility to represent all taxpayers. We are also aware of the responsibility we have to contractors, businesses, and guests, and how our decisions affect their experience on the island. Your village council consists of 5 individuals who have come together in a unanimous consensus that the transportation system needs to be bought by the village for the benefit of the users of that system. The second mistruth is that the village plans to raise taxes to support the system. Although general obligation bonds allow for village taxation, our projections show that there will be no need to do such because of superior economics and governance. Please remember that our transportation system is a monopoly, creating further safeguards. Also, please ignore the fear mongering that is being foisted on our community. The third mistruth is that the Mitchells won't sell to the village. If the general obligation bond passes, the village will be a viable purchaser of the transportation system. We ask that you review the following information in this presentation. We appreciate your time and interest. Thank you. At that, I will turn it over to the other members of the council.
Great. Good morning. This is Mike Brown. Thank you. I'll act as MC, if you will, today and go through the deck that we have, the slides that we have. And I'll ask my fellow council members to please jump in where appropriate to address maybe some issues that I might have missed or just to kind of embellish on the items. Thank you, Mayor Sayre. That was a wonderful introduction. You really kind of hit the items that I was also going to kind of address as well. But resulting from the August town meeting, the public hearing, questions we've received to date, a lot of other issues that we've heard in different meet and greets, et cetera. We've really boiled down some of the key issues for today's review to help our islanders as more of an educational forum today and really address your questions and answers. So with that, I'll go ahead and go into the next slide. So as a background, and personally, I joined the Transportation Authority after I was elected in 2019. I started in 2020, January. As most of us, it was new to me. A lot of this information was being held in confidence. I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. All the trustees did. And so I was eager, and as the village hoped, I was eager that the authority concept and structure would work. A lot of good work, as I noticed, went into what had been done to date through June or January, I should say. A framework was established, asset purchase agreement was established, a transition services agreement with limited was established. So there was some good work that was done. But quite frankly, over the year or so that I saw that, it really kind of fell short. And so why did I feel that the authority fell short? Well, as we worked together, the mayor and myself over the last 2 years in finalizing the price and governance, the village's concerns weren't really addressed or considered. Price was a concern. The debt load was a concern. And it really didn't address the improvements that we had identified as a village in the order of $5 million or more on top of what was identified to really make this a pristine transportation system for the future. And that really kind of led to the governance. We really kind of were out and not heard, and really 7 of the trustees were non-islanders. 4 of the out of 11 were our island owners. So we really felt like, the mayor and myself, that our issues weren't being addressed, and that the element of governance really wasn't in favor of the village's perspective. So this all kind of came to a head in December of 2020, when finally the information could become public. At that time, there was a public vote, 7 in favor of the going forward and 4 dissent, no. Those were the island owners. We had those concerns, we expressed them, and that was at that point. Further citizens kind of further said, well, what's going on here? Where's the transparency, and what is underlying the current deal that is in front of the authority and limited? So there's a lot of background here as far as different dates, but really kind of led into the spring time frame when we said that enough answers weren't being addressed for our citizens. And we decided to go down a parallel path to secure a general obligation bond, and brought on bond counsel and a financial advisor. That's on the next slide. One of the key concerns that was addressed was really, can the village own and operate a ferry? Can the village own and operate property over in Brunswick County and Southport? Those 2 answers were addressed in a May 3rd letter to the LGC from our council, citing different case law, different general statutes, as well as noting that other municipalities operate other properties within their jurisdictions within North Carolina as well. So those items were addressed immediately, and we went down a path to understand what process would the village go through in making application to be considered to acquire the transportation system. We met with bond counsel, and we assumed that we would pursue a revenue bond, just like the Transportation Authority. Bond counsel said, well, you could do a general obligation bond. It's backed by the taxpayers in terms of its credit worthiness, but at the same time, it gives you a lower interest rate and less upfront cost of issuance. And it really acts like a revenue bond in terms of the revenues and cash flows from operations paying for the debt. So it's really the best of both worlds. You have a better credit rating, more cash flow, and an ability to have the debt paid for by cash flows versus taxing the property owners. So we decided the best mechanism going forward financially was to pursue the general obligation bond. And you can see over the next few months, we talked about pursuing that proposal, having public meetings, and we'll come up to November 2nd with the election on the vote on the general obligation bond.
Yeah, I just had one comment. We've been, this is Peter Quinn. We talked about not getting our answers, and that's driving us. And it's a little bit more involved in that. One of the, when we look at this and our intention from the beginning of trying to support it, our reaction is more of, I think, a reaction to a deal that's kind of gone stale or has been complacent. And as your council representing you, we as a council decided that it was our responsibility and we had to be accountable to our citizens to go out and actually start pushing this a lot farther than it was before.
Yeah, also note that the GO bond really gives the village a seat at the table. We understand, we know, we don't have a deal with Limited. But you know what? The framework has been established. You know, we talk about stepping in the shoes of the authority. So passing the GO bond really gives the village a leverage. The best case is the village owns, operates, and pursues the GO bond and its financial benefits. You know, the next best case would be, you know, that the GO bond passes and it, again, gives us leverage as a village, working with the authority for lower pricing, better governance. And it really sends a message to the LGC, the authority, and Limited that our island is behind control and decision-making of our future for the transportation system. So the framework is established. We could quickly move into the shoes and move quickly to acquisition of the transportation system if the LGC approves the application going forward. All right, let's go on to what we've heard about village ownership. All right, so what we've heard after the August town hall meeting, there really was, I'd say, 50-50 for comments against comments in terms of the village ownership. Most of the questions or most of the folks that we really talked to were undecided. A lot of information was out there. Was it factual? Was it exaggerated? Was it fear? But at the same time, we looked at a lot of the information. We kind of highlighted, I guess, 3 key areas of positives, if you will, that people were coming out with on the side of why the village should own the transportation system. This is a 30-year deal. It's a future and livelihood and lifeblood of our island. So a lot of people feel that overseeing and having local management and control of key decisions for the future was a huge plus for our island. The people that ride the system understand the system. Our village employees that ride and public safety, everyone that rides the system every day, providing that input to quickly make decisions in terms of rates, fees, schedules, improvements that are needed, and reservation system coming up. What are the rules and policies around that? So that was a key kind of theme that we saw in a lot of the comments that came in. Understanding that this is really a new organization. We're not asking current village employees to run the system. What we're saying is there's a organization in place. It will be transitioned with local management and control from the village as an oversight. But that transition would be over a 1 to 2 year period. And really tomorrow would look the same as today, but decision-making would be local. This organization would be stood up and populated with key personnel that are key in this area. And that would be a separate organization reporting into the village. The second thing was obviously better financing. The GO bond is a much superior financing tool versus the revenue bond that provides more what I call financial freedom for management. I've had experience in my past where, a leverage deal that has a lot of debt really limits your ability to do any kind of improvements. If what you're worried about is paying that debt off and you need to increase rates or reduce costs just to make those debt payments versus having the financial freedom in order to make critical capital needs. So the increased cash flow every year in the order of the magnitude of over $400,000 on the current deal as an apples to apples and in the range of $5 million up front really provides the village with more financial freedom to do the things that we see that needs to be fixed. The third theme that we saw was that the village has an existing organization and infrastructure to leverage. Not burden, but leverage. HR people, finance people, communications, IT are there to help in this transition and to help with building this new structure that we'll have. We have certified municipal experienced professionals that the authority doesn't have in place yet. So really it's a faster time frame to ramp up the organization going forward. So go ahead.
Can I just make a comment about that?
Yep.
So we talk about the village organization and transportation. We always keep on looking back to, well, it's a ferry, it's the barge. every aspect of our life on the island is affected by the ferry. And when we're looking at management, we have a proven management on this island. They don't deal with one aspect of the island. They have to deal with the entire island, the different utilities, the fire, the public safety. And it's important to understand that they know how to collaborate with each other. And they know how to look at any aspect of the island from different perspectives. The most important thing is that they are experienced in working together. And I think that's, you know, something that gets overlooked when we're comparing it to the Transportation Authority.
Great. Concerns. Next slide. There are concerns that and this is what we're here today to address these items: property tax impact, debt capacity, impact of other critical projects. Can roads be done? Can Village Hall be completed? Can these other things be completed at the same time as managing a transportation authority? The management and governance structure. And last, we won't go into a lot of depth on this, and I'll ask Mayor Sayre to kind of talk to, and I think you addressed this in your opening statement, but the LG approval process and, Bald Head Island Limited's willingness to sell to the village. So if you can kind of embellish a little bit on that, on over the last month, the kind of things that you've heard and talked about.
Yes, well, as Mike has said, that obviously we are not in active negotiations with the seller. However, we've had informal discussions, and they have some concerns that we have been addressing about our legal ability to own it, and our and other. About the governance, whether it is wise to have the governance in a relatively small island government. But I think we've just dispelled or will dispel most of the or all of those concerns. It's by passage of the bond ordinance, I believe that we will demonstrate as a community our ability to purchase and manage through a new organization the entire transportation system. And as well as the ferry, we must consider that this entails both the warehouse, but more importantly, the barge and of course the parking, which is a critical financial component of the purchase.
Thank you. Go ahead. Yes.
Good night. This is Scott Gardner. With regard to the Limited's willingness to sell to the village, I think it needs to be pointed out that it is clear that that Limited and the Mitchell family want the Transportation Authority proposal to get approval. We understand that and we get that. The village's move is nothing against Bald Head Island Limited or the Mitchell family. They've done an amazing job developing this island, protecting this island. We get that, we understand that. Our concern is with the Transportation Authority's lack of some due diligence that led to a sales price that we still question, in particular, their lack of transparency and their lack of responsiveness to island concerns. Those are the things that led us, based on a significant amount of island input, to do something to make sure we're going to be protected here. And that's why we stepped in. Several of us have had experience negotiating with Bald Head Island Limited on a number of issues. And I will tell you, they are tough negotiators. There's no question about it. That's why the Mitchell family has been so successful in business over the years. They are tough negotiators, and I give them credit for that. But at the same time, when you have people that can negotiate and there's back and forth, then ultimately we get to a solution that becomes a win-win for both parties. I am confident in my experiences dealing with Chad Paul and with Limited that if given the opportunity, we will find common ground. We will find a solution that becomes a win-win for everybody, if given the chance.
Great, Scott.
Yep.
I mean, one of the things also, I'll go ahead and bring that up is the concept of a third-party buyer coming in, splitting up the system. If the village is causing this potential problem, personally, I could only speculate, if I was an individual looking as an entity to come in right now and let's say buy the parking, to me, it would feel like there's a cloud over a deal that may occur with a third party right now. I mean, you definitely, if you were going to buy, a piece of this business, you would want to have a great working relationship with the village and the property owners here on Baldhead Island. So this is this would be, in my speculation, a cloud over any third party buyer coming in until this gets resolved between the authority and the village. There's speculation that the Utilities Commission could regulate the parking and the ferry service. There's speculation, and we definitely know that the village has a right of first refusal, legal aspect that's hanging out there. And, those two things alone, I think, create a lot of cloud and doubt over, a potential buyer, in my mind, speaking as an individual here. Next slide. The revenue obligations versus GeoBond. I think we've talked a lot about what the differences are, so I don't think we need to go into details there. At the end of the day, the box on the bottom, and Mayor Sayre mentioned it right at the get-go, issuing GeoBonds does not mean that property taxes are used for the operational expenses. Basically, it's an insurance policy. The weight of the ferry system is behind and paying off the debt is behind really the revenues and the cash flows of that system. As the mayor mentioned, the financial projections under the authority scenario, are pay the debt, doesn't provide as much financial freedom as a GO bond would. But at the end of the day, we'll talk about later in the deck, what are the other options that would occur in some sort of catastrophe. People like to say, well, if there's a catastrophe, what would happen? In 30 years that Limited has run this system, we've had hurricanes, we had COVID, we had Florence, where we were down for a month or so with no riders. The system was profitable. We haven't had to bankrupt the system over how many years that the transportation system has been working here. So that kind of goes to an extreme in my viewpoint. Let's look at what we can do and what we can make with the system under village ownership going forward. The next slide talks about the financial proposal comparisons. The pro forma under the revenue bond calls for 20% fare increase now. In order to get the BBB- credit rating, these things are built into the case, not now, but going forward, future price increases. We already saw parking go up in advance. We already saw the barge go up in advance. These were all set in place in order to obtain that credit rating. So that's kind of under that scenario. If there's a revenue shortfall, the authority doesn't have any other assets. The assets are being secured by the debt on the revenue and the transportation system. So the only options really there are to increase rates and decrease services, cut costs. On the village's side, the GO bond, as we already mentioned, provides more cost savings up front and more cost savings every year in order to build those reserves, do more now. And at the end of the day, we'll talk about this again at the end of the deck, but a small ticket price increase results in a much better benefit in terms of revenue and bottom line. $1 on 370,000 riders provides an immediate $307,000 in that year in terms of cash flow for some minute or small tax increase. So I think you'll see later in the deck that makes more sense.
This is Emily Hill. What I hear when I talk to people is the issue of a revenue bond versus a GO bond and how they get paid back. Even though the GO bond is a GO bond with general obligation, we are assuming, based on the same thing the authority is assuming, that there's revenues for operations. So while it is a GO bond, essentially the debt service will be paid through revenues. And I think that's important. We really are starting out there. The GO bond and the ownership by the village allows us to have other options and controls and financing opportunities.
Great. Next slide, please. Okay, village debt capacity. I think most people know that the village raises most of its fund through property taxes, occupancy taxes that are paid through the rentals. You know, additional funds come into the village through grant funds. We issue bonds, we get installment loans. The LGC oversees within North Carolina all sales and issuance of local government debt. You need to go to the LGC body to get debt approved, and they monitor the debt. They monitor different villages. There's different villages that are in trouble. Different villages are doing well. We are doing well. I give Treasurer Falwell a lot of credit in the regiment and oversee that he and the LGC have implemented within North Carolina, and applaud them for that. For GO bond orders to be adopted, the net debt of the unit, meaning the village, cannot exceed 8% of the village's total assessed property values, which are subject to taxation. Now, one thing that's interesting about that, a revenue bond does not count towards that 8%, because a revenue bond assumes that, and it does, the revenues and the cash flows pay for that debt. So this is very similar in that the GO bond does this, but we still need to adhere to these 8% guidelines. Based on the current appraised property values and our village debt to date, we are at 1.4%. The addition of this proposed $54 million GO bond would bring our total anywhere between the 5.9 to 6.2% range, well below the 8% range. And we'll see the next couple slides what that means. Next slide. All right. So this provides a current snapshot of where we are. On the left-hand side, you see our current debt outstanding is roughly about $16 million. We have $2.3 million of unused or unissued bonds that resulted from the sand placement GO bond from a few years back. So that's sitting there out there as a liability, if you will. We haven't used it. We may not need to use it. The addition of the $54 million to that would bring us to $72.2 million of debt, gross debt. On the right-hand side is what is our kind of our value, if you will. The assessed value of property is roughly $1.2 billion in Bald Head Island. If you took the 8% of that $1.2 billion, that gives you a cap of around $93 million. So right now, if you look at the $72 million versus $93 million, that puts us to the 6.21%. So that was the reference from the other side. So one could say, well, that only leaves you about $21 million of additional asset accessible debt in fiscal year 23. And especially when you're looking at a few things on the bottom there of the chart, a new village hall, 2.2 million, future beach renourishment if needed in fiscal year 28 of $15 million, and a wastewater treatment plant, if not financed through revenue bonds. Again, those do not go towards the cap, but that would be another $13 million. So one would say, well, you know, that brings you well above the 21. Let's go to the next page, because really next two pages, I would say, but the next page kind of shows you a graphic, and we'll have details after that, but kind of shows you a graphic of how the debt works over time. And I call it a waterfall chart, but essentially you see how the green is the debt going up over time. So raises up to that $72 million in fiscal year 23, the peaks there, then it's paid off over time. And then in 28, you have the beach renourishment coming in. So it goes up to another peak, goes down. And then you have, I think, roadway, a total island-wide roadway pavement after a lot of the construction is done, and we don't have to redo roads over and over. So this is an island-wide roadway construction. So it peaks up again, and then it goes down over the next several years. So this is a 30-year view. The top line represents the value, I think it was 1.2 billion. Yeah, the 1.2 billion, how that grows over time. And it's really growing on new construction, not value, if you will, not appreciation. It's saying, okay, a new home added at about $1 million per year. You know, we have what, 35 homes under construction right now. you assume anywhere between 15 and 20 homes per year that come online over the next several years. So that kind of shows you the room. The yellow is the room, the available capacity, if you will. So there's plenty of capacity in terms of debt.
Okay, Mike, as Andy Sayre, if I could step in here. On the right-hand corner, bottom corner, the debt capacity assumes 0.75% annual growth in property values due to new construction. That equates to about, I believe, $9 million or so per year. And you can take a look around our island right now, and with 30 plus homes under construction, say that it's perhaps it's as much as $1 million average per home. So you can see the difference between $9 million and $30 million is substantial. Now, is that 30 going to continue over time? No, it's going to diminish. But still, this is a very conservative look at our asset base.
And again, the wastewater treatment upgrade project would be done with grant funds and revenue bonds, which again don't go towards the cap.
Can I just
go ahead?
Jack here, just really quickly. Part of this is educational meeting. There's been a lot of misinformation about our island basically going down the tubes and how horrible things are. And when you look at these charts, it's obvious the island is flourishing. We're doing great right now. And so the idea of taking on more debt, this is definitely the right time to do it, at least by these charts.
Right.
And by the financial realities in today's world too.
That's right.
Low interest rates, et cetera. All right, next slide. Now this shows the details behind the graphs. So folks can see really what are we talking about, and why don't we go above like where we are in $68-69 million would be the peak. So on the left-hand side is green. That's the current debt. Those current bonds and loans outstanding. We have the 2018 beach sand placement. That's looks like it'll be totally paid off by 2027. We have the marina. That looks like it'll be paid off in the next fiscal year, this year. Public Safety 1 and Public Safety 2 go through to about the 27 timeframe. And then the contractor services project will go into the next 10 years, but that's just starting at 1.7 million. So that's our current debt right now that we talked about.
And the contractor services also generates revenue.
That's right, generates revenue to help pay that debt. On the proposed debt in the middle, that's the yellow section. So we have the ferry, that's the 54 million, and that's how that is paid off over 30 years. The next is the Village Hall, which comes online in 2023. And you see how that goes over until the mid 2037 timeframe, 2036. And then if needed, another beach sand placement paid for by the village, and that would be a $15 million GO bond in the 2028 timeframe. Again, that's an if needed. There's a lot of, and Andy's probably closer to it than I, but in terms of, sand placement and who's next and, what, would we need it to another one coming up, and with potential channel deepening, who knows what time frame that would occur.
Yeah, it's with our sand management plan, which is unique to Bald Head Island. I don't think there's another one in the country. We get sand, and it's a 6-year cycle where we get sand in the second year and the fourth year, and then Caswell Beach gets and Oak Island gets it the 6th year. We have historically not made it through more than 2 years without a private placement. However, and it's prudent to plan for that. Two things. One, we gotten an enormous amount of sand this past year, more than we've ever gotten before for South Beach. And secondly, as Mike alludes to, the deepening of the channel, which I'm not sure that can be stopped in any way, or would we want to stop it, but we do want to have in their projections, in the ports and the Corps projections, mitigation dollars and mitigation concerns if they do harm Bald Head Island. But as has been pointed out by the ports, this, if the deepening happens, is going to generate an enormous amount of sand that has to be used beneficially on adjacent beaches.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. And then to the right is potential debt. Oh, go back.
I'm so sorry.
That's right. So road construction 2033, that is, as I mentioned, an island-wide project. What do we have? About $500,000 worth of road paving done this year. We could, with COVID last year, we missed it, but we do road paving every year. So, there's going to be a significant amount of road paving done this year and every year out of the general fund budget. And this basically says, okay, by the time build out gets to a certain point, we can do an entire island-wide construction there. And then again, another projection back way out in 2038 for the beach. So on the far right kind of shows you how it adds up. And again, the waterfall. So really we peak at about $69 million with the ferry authority coming in. It goes down, comes up a little and continually goes down. So again, this is not unmanageable. We can do more things than one thing at a time, and just basically shows that the debt capacity is there. Next slide, thanks. Capital expenditures, I think we hit that already. The savings with the GO bond really addresses immediate concerns with, as the village has pointed out, that we're not included in the authority's proposal and no room to really do it. But the village has room within the GO bond process to immediately address a lot of items that have been deferred. Next slide. Okay, governance accountability. I kind of talked about this initially on the authority, an 11-person authority. The governor appoints one, General Assembly appoints two, Department of Transportation appoints three. Out of those appointments, one must be a Bald Head Island resident. The village has control of three. We have the mayor pro tem, and one other appointment. And they do have a proposal to establish an advisory committee, which are constituents of the users of the system. On the village's side, we would again not encumber, but adjoin with the current village management structure into the village manager. It would be separate department, much like public safety, and stood up, and the revenues that are generated out of that system would be there to fund the people and the processes and the improvements there. And we also talk about establishing a transportation advisor committee. There's a one-pager on our village's website that has 3 or 4 paragraphs that kind of address that. But we would look to immediately stand up a 7-person organization, representatives from business owners, homeowners, nonprofits, to really provide input on rates, schedules, reservation policies, improvements that are needed. They would report to the village manager, the chief operating officer of the transportation system, and the council on what is really needed for the system. Again, the council is elected by the residents and are accountable to all the island stakeholders, unlike the authority, which a majority of which is not. Next slide on operations.
Can I throw something in first? We go back, when we talk about an advisory board, when I read that, it sounds very soft. And if you look at the professionals that we have in our community, there's a role that advisory board would have that's, it's not well defined yet, but I want to think that it's going to be as much a fiduciary type advisory board. You have people that are going to be checking on us all the time. And keeping us accountable to everything we're doing.
Great, thanks. Next slide on operations. So the Transportation Authority is a new startup. Now, again, they'll enter into a transition services agreement with Limited. But we really would need to stand up its financial services organization, human resources, IT, communications, et cetera. No real authority. The authority really has no experience in operating a utility, and the members serve on rotating terms. we do commend Captain Stewart being hired as the new experienced COO. I think that is, I really appreciate, and I know the council does, and we sent out a note as such that what a great hire, what a great long-term person to work together with the village, especially in terms of any time of emergency operations and long-term needs. So again, we do commend Captain Stewart being brought on board. On the Bald Head Island side, we talked about, the structure being working with the current village structure. We have systems in place, we have finance, we have HR. Not that these folks would be doing the work, but can bring on the right type of people to do the work in conjunction with our current village employees. And we do have experience acquiring like the wastewater treatment plant and operating utilities. Next slide. Financial risks on the ownership. The transportation authorities is a BBB- credit rating. Really has limited ability to raise additional cash if needed and additional funding sources. The LGC would step in and bondholders would step in to run the authority. I think, in the worst case scenario, do you think that the state will jump in, the Department of Transportation or the ferry system, would take this over if the worst case happened? No, I think that the LGC and the bondholders, LGC would look to Village of Bald Head Island to buy out the receivership, the debt from the bondholders in worst case scenario. So I think at the end of the day, the state would look to the village to own and operate this, not some Department of Transportation.
Yeah, I think you just need to clarify that some more. I mean, the state is not going to come in and bail out the transportation authority. If the revenue bonds fail, it's going to go into receivership with the LGC.
Right. We talked about the village on its strong credit history in terms of, you saw the waterfall chart in terms of different kinds of debt we brought on, access to lines of credit, working with banks, other assets to obtain loans against, et cetera. And would continue to work below the LGC's cap of indebtedness.
Mike, this is Scott Gardner again. So, the issue of the village's indebtedness and the bond ratings and so forth continue to come up. Although we don't have a stated bond rating because we've never asked for a significant amount of GO bond debt that we require any necessarily, we're just not big enough. There are similar examples like a Bald Head Island. And the example that comes to mind is Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, which is very similar to Bald Head. They just issued and have obtained a GO rating in the AA1/AA plus level, which is the second highest possible rating. They have no commercial and they have no industrial. It's all residential. It's just like us. And we are very confident that that in the process of securing bond ratings, we will be looked upon very favorably because of our tax base and because of our history of paying off indebtedness on time.
Yeah, we've Scott and I worked with Tryon Services, and they've looked at South Carolina, North Carolina, different types of size cities, villages, municipalities. They feel very strongly that would be a AA. All right, let's talk about, again, revenue shortfall, the next slide. So again, what if we need funds immediately for an emergency? Cash flows would be set aside for reserves from operations. That's just good management, fiscal management of the business. In addition, the village would have bank lines of credit, additional bank loans could be obtained. There would be temporary access to the general fund reserves if needed. And if there was a hurricane, obviously insurance would come in and step in to play just like the authority. We've all seen how long it takes to get those proceeds from insurance companies. So, I don't know what the authority would do in terms of cash flow in order to operate in the short term. We have available cash and access to cash in order to operate in the short term. The village has a credit rating and debt experience to get that cash. So let's talk about a property tax increase versus a ticket price increase. A one set property tax increase raises about $115,000. So essentially what that means on the property tax increase of a cent across the island equates to about $100 per home per year on a $1 million home. So that would generate about $115,000. A $1 ferry ticket increase would generate on ridership about $375,000 based upon previous year's ridership. So a small ticket increase really leverages a financial impact that's much easier and better to implement than a tax increase. So you could see where that pay-as-you-go model would really be tapped into first versus any kind of tax increase.
Yeah, and the pay-as-you-go is key. It's, if you need an influx of money, waiting for your taxes is not a viable answer.
Right. So the credit rating of the GO bond gives you much better cash flow. It's more of an insurance policy, but much better to work with. So moving forward, the LG staff has received the village's GO bond application. I think Treasurer Falwell said this is the first time in history that they've seen two applications for one deal at the same time. He had some very interesting comments posted in a recent article that if the bond passes, that it would be looked at very seriously. And the village would if in doing so, the village would look to initiate negotiations with Limited. We would expect a very quick closing. I said that the framework is in place. It's not uncommon that a buyer falls out of a negotiation with a seller and the same kind of framework is already established, and one could step into the shoes pretty quickly. We talked about establishing the advisory committee, and we would talk about bringing on a small consulting group in order to work with staff and transition between the current limited operations and the village and what we need to do to staff the organization for the long-term success. All right, in conclusion, next slide. We've really made every effort we can in order to inform the public of the transaction. We really stood up back in December and said, time out. Our citizens want to learn more about this. And in doing so, it raised a lot of questions in terms of valuation, transparency, and governance. We're prepared to acquire this and be good stewards going forward in terms of the public interest, the island homeowners, the vendors, the contractors, the businesses that come here every day, the people, the vacationers that come here, the others from other places of the state that come here. We're really in looking to the public interest. We have the financial resources to operate this as a first-class system. We have the makeup and response and the ability to be very responsive to make changes to the system based upon property owners, residents, and those inputs. The GO bond, as we said, is much better financial mechanism versus a revenue bond. So with that, before we go into the Q&A, I'll go ahead and just ask our fellow council persons for any kind of closing thought before we have any Q&A. I'll go ahead and turn it over first to Peter.
Okay. I always have to go first. I know, it's terrible. Yeah, there's when I listen to our whole presentation and all the presentations we've had so far, there's a lot of figures that you're looking at, charts, et cetera. And we always keep it at arm's length. And by arm's length, this is a really personal issue. When we're talking about revenue and all these equations, we are the revenue. So something that people somehow can glaze over, it's like when you're paying too much or you think you're paying too much for your meals, or you're concerned about the schedule of the barge, you're not getting materials that you want, or when you're picking up packages, you're paying for all those things. So in all these equations, you're the revenue. And so when I'm looking at questions of why you should be voting for the GO bond, it's less expensive. Why would you pay more for something that you're doing daily? The other thing that, another big issue, at least for me, is accountability. You know, when I look at any issue on the island and you have a complaint, you have a concern, you write Chris McCall, and we keep on referring to it as the village. Again, it's personal. You're writing a letter to Chris McCall. If you don't know it, all those letters, any communications also go to every member of the council. It goes to our communications person. It gets spread down the chain of command so that the people who are actually responsible see what's going on. I think an ultimate threat has always been, I know where you live, and the reality is being a local entity responsible for things, you know who we are. In the same situation, if you had a complaint and the Transportation Authority had control, I was like, well, maybe I'll call the representative from Brunswick County. The comparison is not, it's just not favorable. The other thing that when Scott talked about this a lot the other day in the forum, he talked about the village being responsible for essential services. There's no doubt this is an essential service. We need to look at it that way. It's a utility. It's something we all depend on. And so when you're going and you're deciding whether or not to vote for the GO bond, it's an insurance policy so that we get considered for getting this. And it's an insurance policy for something that is essential to everything we do.
Great, thanks.
It was almost speech-like, Sorry.
Right. Emily, would you like to go next?
Sure. I think there's several things to think about and that have been brought to me. One, I've already said, while it's a GO bond, it's going to be paid based on revenue. The village ownership and the negotiations with limited allow us, while we have that structure, to potentially negotiate some other things with limited. The authority has a set, it includes certain things, and that's it. They don't really have the opportunity to go back and negotiate any other items at all. So I think that's a benefit. Someone asked me the other day about, well, what's going to happen with the transition? I mean, like, who's going to be working there and who's going to, well, I would hope that it was going to be the staff that we have now with the addition of our new head of that department. So, whether it's the authority or us, we're going to hope that most of our transportation employees are going to come on board and still be working for us. It's not like it's going to be abolished and you have to go out and find people all over the place. So during that transition, that's what we will be doing, with working and looking with employees, but it'll look a lot the same. I would love to say that it would be looking a lot different in terms of operations the day we acquire it, but these are complex issues in terms of being on time and baggage and trams and all of that. But we would have that advisory committee who experiences all that and looks at it. The other thing I just want to re-emphasize, the Bald Head Island Transportation Authority has been in existence, I guess they're going on 4 years now, but they haven't operated or run anything yet. Okay, so when it said that they have experience running a ferry system, they don't. That body's never run a ferry system. There are transportation authorities all over the place for airports and various other things. If you look at the makeup of those, they are really represented by people who are users of that system. So if you've got a transportation authority for an airport in a metropolitan area, it's going to have input from that area because it impacts those people. So we should have, this authority really has people other than us who are making decisions and looking at operations. So I think that I can stop now. Wait.
Well, beforehand, I wanted to say there was one thing that really struck me. About a month ago or so, we were talking, and you talked about the bridge from nowhere. That is a great, I don't want to call it a parable, but in terms of this is our island and, what other, how others may perceive. If you could tell that, it's a nice story.
Mike loves stories. He loves this story. So when the village built that timber bridge going into the harbor, somebody on the island, a friend, said to me, well, that's a bridge to nowhere. And I chuckled and said, but it's a bridge to me. When we look at the ferry from the state standpoint, that's a bridge to a small entity of rich people. And, we're not going to be connecting with any other municipality or anything like that. So, in my mind, from their perspective, is that ferry being seen as kind of like a ferry to nowhere, to this little place that's out there alone, that we don't have to interact with unless we choose to, and that doesn't connect that to anything else in North Carolina. So
yeah, but bringing that back to where we are. So we should be supporting the GO bond because
it's a bridge to
we
us.
are somewhere.
It's a bridge to us.
It's a ferry to us. It's a ferry to us.
Right,
Yes.
a ferry to us. All right, thank you. Scott.
Sure. As we've said many, many times, we wanted the Transportation Authority to work. And after 3 some odd years, and the proposal came out, and finally the public had a chance to see and understand where this thing might be going. As any community would, they wanted to ask questions so they could understand. The Transportation Authority denied them the opportunity to hear answers to those questions, denied them the opportunity to present information and get serious questions asked, and not just once, not just twice, but over and over again. And if it wasn't for the Local Government Commission, I'm convinced we would have never had a public meeting. If it weren't for the Local Government Commission hearing us, they've heard us far better than the Transportation Authority did. And so our only choice, and we made it in March, was to, assuming that the Transportation Authority proposal may not get approval, we needed to have a solution, a second choice. And that's when we made our ploy. We checked out the legal questions that were thrown at us that said the village can't run a ferry, the village can't borrow money to own a ferry, the village can't own property in Southport. Well, we may not have to own it, but we can certainly work arrangements with property owners over there and have lease arrangements. There's a bottom line, folks, is there is a number of good answers to the legal questions that were thrown at us, and those are behind us. Now, will there be legal challenges? I'm sure there will. In this litigious society, people look for any way they can to slow something down, and we're ready for that as well. We looked at how could we best fund this thing. We looked at revenue bonds, other installment loan bonds, but when the general obligation bond proposal was flashed in front of us that demonstrated the ability to save $5.5 million up front to fix things that the Transportation Authority couldn't, when it showed we could save $13 million over the 30-year term, which equates to $450,000 a year to make improvements that the Transportation Authority could not, it became a no-brainer to us. How in the world would island residents not understand and want the village to own and operate, make some significant improvements on the front end, make significant improvements over the long-term operationally? It was the right thing to do. And lastly, people have said, we don't have a deal. Well, of course we don't have a deal. We shouldn't have a deal right now. We shouldn't have a contract right now because the Transportation Authority's contract is sitting in front of limited right now. And the only way we get a chance to sit up at the negotiating table is if the general obligation bond is approved. At that point, we become a viable buyer. At that point, the LGC has a big choice to make. They can choose the Transportation Authority still, or they can choose the village. And we will be ready, if they choose the village, we will be ready to immediately step up to the negotiating table, buckle up our pants, tighten the belt, and have very candid and frank conversations with limited. But I'm telling you, as I'm living right now, I am very confident we're going to find the common ground. We're going to find a deal that's going to work well for the Mitchell family and for Bald Head Island Limited and for the residents of this island, property owners of this island, and users of the ferry system.
Can I just highlight something Scott says? So it's critical that, right now, when we talk about the GO bond, it puts us at the table. It's not, we're not spending the money immediately. It's an insurance policy, and it doesn't obligate us even to use it. What it does, it puts us in the position to actually start to be recognized by the LGC and also by Limited, giving Limited an option to be negotiating with us.
Great, thanks. All right, Mayor Sayre.
To say that we have a special, although perhaps complex relationship with the Mitchell family is an understatement. This island would not exist without their participation, and I believe truly that they want the best for the island that is available to us and to them, and also protects their rights and their values. So I believe that in passage of the bond referendum that we will send the message that we want to work with you. And I truly believe that they want to work with us. It's a legacy issue. It's an economic issue. And it's just the right thing to do. And my trust is with them.
Great, thank you. All right, let's go to the questions. We had several that were brought in prior.
I want to go here first, I think we said.
Okay, I didn't
We
know
would
that.
go
All right.
live first.
All right, go live first. So do we have any questions from anyone in the audience?
I was going to wait to hear what the Zoom questions.
Okay. All right, anybody else? All right.
Is that a question?
We do have questions. All right, so the first question came in from Jack Frost, and we'll ask Emily to address it. And it talks about will anyone beyond the 360 or so registered voters on the island have the ability to vote, go or no go on the bond. And he talks about the seller has come out and said that there's no way that they'd sell to the village. I think the mayor has addressed to that. Why would we have these meetings and information exchanges if that's not true? I think that the mayor addressed that. Do I have a vote? And why are we talking about the bond if the seller won't sell to the village? So I think we talked about that, but let me go ahead and turn it over to Emily.
Okay, actually, there are at least 3 questions here about voting rights, and I've received a lot more and had a lot of other people ask me. So voting, who can vote is under the jurisdiction of the Brunswick County Board of Election, who has to follow state law. So the village can't grant anybody the right to vote. Okay, that is outside our control and outside our influence. Recently, and I think it was about August, the Brunswick County Board of Elections posted something that addressed second home owners. You know, there are several beach communities around here, and whether they could vote. And the answer was no. So you have to have a plan to live here permanent. This is to be established as your resident. You need to be here 30 days before a vote, and you have every intent to make this your full-time home. So as someone on the Board of Elections said to me, one way you kind of figure that out is where do you get your mail? So if you have your mail forwarded here from another address, then what is your real home? If your mail primarily comes here, that would imply that you are probably here and intended to stay here. Now, that takes away people who are in the process of moving right now, because we have some new homeowners. But it is an intent to be here. The village in no way can, under state law, extend that to other property owners.
Exactly. Great. All right. Next question was from Deborah Drumheller. The village financial advisor suggested the village will obtain a AA rating on the GO bond. Has the advisor ever done a GO bond issue for a town of comparable size, effectively all residential and no industry, that has obtained a AA rating? Can the advisor point to another North Carolina municipality of similar size, effectively all residential again, that has such a rating? I can turn that over to Scott.
Yeah, sure. And I mentioned that in my comments earlier. It's interesting that questions come up again. And the example I gave was Sullivan's Islands, Florida, which has the second highest rating. It's an all residential community, coastal community, just like ours. And I don't know quite what they borrowed their money for, but it was a general obligation bond, and they received the second highest rating they could. And we are confident, because of our tax base, because of the way we've paid off our debt in the past, that we're going to be able to achieve at least AA in that range bond rating when we apply. I would also add that the uniqueness of Bald Head, to my knowledge, no other coastal community, North or South Carolina for that matter, has had to spend the money to the tune of $15 million in a GO bond to stabilize its beach as frequently as we have. So in so doing, we've demonstrated that we can pay off that debt. But it does force us to have to raise the tax rate. We did it at three levels, those on the beach, those behind the beach, and those in the maritime forest. So it's 3 different levels of taxation to fund that obligation. We also have our purchase, or if we proceed with this and GO bond passes and we get a seat at the table and we work a deal, we will be buying a ferry system. No other coastal community that I'm familiar with along North and South Carolina is having to purchase its own or buy its own ferry system to get people to and from. North of us, you have the North Carolina Port Transportation Department that owns and operates the ferry system that run the Outer Banks. We are, and just next to us, the Southport Fort Fisher Ferry is part of that system. But it's highly subsidized by the state. We're not getting any help to fund this system here, nor should we expect to get any help. It's just not going to happen. Having spent as much time as I did in Raleigh in the legislative building, I can tell you Bald Head Island is not going to get any help to fund this ferry system. The last thing I would say is we are also unique in that we do not have any state roads on Bald Head Island. Every other coastal community has a state road on it. The up front, the Outer Banks up north, Highway 12, you got the Emerald Isle, you got in heading south, they all have state roads on them, which means the State Department of Transportation maintains and fixes those roads. We don't get any of that funding on Bald Head Island. It's all on us. So the uniqueness of Bald Head that we love so much, the nature, driving around in golf carts, the community of people that we have here, it's all wonderful, but it's a little bit more costly because of its uniqueness. And I think people lose sight of that when they look at having to fund a deal like a transportation authority purchase.
It's what you're saying though is, and we're paying for those things. Mm-hmm. When you're looking at evaluating our rating, mm-hmm. And you're comparing to other communities that don't have to pay those kinds of things. We have to pay them, and we've been meeting it, and our financials prove that we've been really, I want to say, conservative about doing it and still meeting it.
Great point. Thank you. I didn't make that as clear as I meant to. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
The village has obviously borrowed money, issued bonds in order to stabilize our shoreline. And these were not necessarily Band-Aids. This is a program that the village council has been applying to the problem for 15, 20 years. Recently, I had a conversation with our coastal engineer, Eric Olson, an incredible asset to the village. And he opined that Bald Head Island has the best shoreline stabilization program in North Carolina. So that, I believe, is indicative of how we borrow money to make improvements, to do things right. And we will do that with the transportation system.
Mike, one last thing. This Zach Hewitt, our financial advisor, just informed me that our finance director, just informed me that our financial advisor, who's listening in, just wanted to make us aware that the community of Blowing Rock, North Carolina, also has, which is similar to us, and it's a small community, very visitor driven, but they have a AA bond rating, similar sized community, AA bond rating.
Great, thank you. The third question came in from Michael, and I'll mispronounce his last name, Makakakis. Anyway, he talks about, I think it's the same things. Can second homeowners on Bald Head Island have a vote with policies regarding the village of Bald Head Island? Can second homeowners vote on BHI policies? Well, we wish they could, but I think, Elman, you kind of address that.
Yeah, I did want to add to that. Would we like for everybody to be able to have a vote? And yes, we would, but we can't do that. Secondly, we do listen to all property owners. So my guess, and this is off the top of my head and looking at all the emails that come to us through the village, we probably have at least half, but maybe even more comments and questions that come in from property owners versus residents. And I see Chris McCall shaking his head. He's going like, we do get a lot of questions from property owners, and we do try to address those. And Chris is very good about making sure those are addressed. We have restrictions by state law.
And that's kind of the next question goes next.
Well, Mike,
go ahead.
Scott, one more thing. I think it's important to remind people that I think 2 election cycles ago, we had about 220 registered voters. And then we had COVID and other issues. And I'm sure the ferry system issue is driving some of this, but we're now up, I believe, in the 330 to 340 registered voter range. So we've grown well over 100 people in the last or 100 voters in the last 2 election cycles. People are making Bald Head a more permanent residence. And I think that trend is going to continue. And as that happens, the more and more people will be voting on the issues affecting the island.
The next question from Mr. Kurlik, who's formerly a property owner, kind of addresses the same thing. So there's a common theme here about is, what's the percentage of island property owners, taxpayers that will actually get to vote on it? I don't know how many households the voter register would be, that maybe in the 200 out of 1,200 homes, I'm not sure, but, it's kind of hard to kind of estimate that percentage. And Emily, you kind of looked into this as well.
Yeah, well, I actually sent a letter to all property owners and used the Brunswick County tax office register. So it's very interesting to look at that. There are some people with multiple, same person with multiple properties, as you might guess. Limited has a number of properties. The Village has properties. The association has properties. So it's really pretty difficult to figure out how many individual voters that would represent. But it's certainly we don't represent the majority of property owners as residents, but it is growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because this is a critical question for everybody, and it's critical for all vacation or second home communities. The thing that I don't remember who I was joking to about this, but it's like we deal with essential services. The ferry is an essential service. The Village can't look at it as, well, no, we're only answering to these 350 people. You can't divide up your utilities. You can't divide up your police force to only address the issues of one small group. So all of our structure is geared for answering to all of the residents on this island, whether you're voting or not.
Our next question again was in the same vein. Martin Tyson, again, non-resident property. I think we hit that enough. So again, it's really the voters that are allowed, permitted to vote during the election on the GO bond. Bob Blau came in with a question. Will the Village petition the Utilities Commission to regulate Limited's parking and barge operations, much as the Village, the Bald Head Island Club, and the association did in 2010, when Limited last filed a request for the Utilities Commission to increase regulated BHI passenger ferry rates? Would the threat of the regulation affect what other commercial operators might be willing to pay Limited for its barge and parking operations? Would the passenger ferry remain regulated by the Utilities Commission if Limited sold the transportation system to one or more commercial buyers? I'll ask Scott if he could address that.
Sure. So in answer to the first question, will the Village petition the Utilities Commission to regulate it? I don't think we're going to have to do that. We could, and we would be prepared to if you needed to, but I don't think we're going to have to do that. I think if the GO bond passes, I think we're going to be able to sit down with Limited and move forward with trying to work a deal. But that option is valid and it is there. And if push came to shove, it would be used. Second question, would the threat of regulation affect another commercial operator that might be willing to pay Limited for its parking? Absolutely. I can tell you, having worked for a regulated utility, it sure would have been nice to not have to be regulated by the Utilities Commission. That is one tough bunch of people up there, and they work hard to make sure the using and consuming public is protected. But as the major power company in the state, we understand the regulated monopoly that we are and were when I worked there, and it's the right approach to take. And in the case of a ferry system that moves people back and forth, that relies on the parking system to make that ferry, to get people on and off that ferry, that relies on the barge system to provide the commodities coming to and the other things going off the island, all should be combined into one function and would clearly, if regulated, affect the potential list of commercial buyers. Last question, would the passenger ferry remain regulated by the Utilities Commission if sold to the if the transportation system was sold to a commercial buyer? If that likelihood ever happened, which is infinitesimal, the chance that the parking and barge would be sold and the ferry not, But if the ferry were left, it would remain regulated by the North Carolina Utilities Commission. And the question becomes, is that what would Limited want to continue to operate that system? I don't know. They would have a hard time finding a buyer for just the ferry system, for just the ferry and not parking and barge combined.
Right, right.
Can I just make a point there? So in terms of the Utilities Commission, so if the village were to require that, we would not be under the Utilities Commission, which would means that we could look at fees, ticket prices, barge ferries. We could be as creative as we thought was appropriate in doing that. So that would give us some options. And Andy, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I do believe at one point in time, the state was approached about buying this ferry system early in the days, is what I've heard. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I don't think they want it.
I don't remember the specifics about it, but it was the ferry system. Limited wanted to have the ferry system because they needed the ferry system to sell real estate and to operate their various entities over here. And so I don't think there was ever a concerted effort by the village or the club. I think may have had something to do with that, and maybe the association as well. But it's all pretty vague, and I don't think it ever really went very far.
Yeah, Mike, Scott again. I just want to be clear. The regulation, the Utilities Commission, the village would be treated just like the Transportation Authority would be. Once the Transportation Authority, if they were proposed to be approved, the Utilities Commission would relinquish its regulation over the ferry component, and the Transportation Authority would then be totally responsible for rates and service. And the same would be true for the village. Once the village took ownership, the Utilities Commission steps away, and the village would then take ownership and responsibility for rates and service. Just wanted to make that we're just like the TA in that regard with regard to regulation.
Yeah, I will say that both of us would still be under the Coast Guard's authorities, everything that's going to go out there. So they're still responsible for closing the river following hurricanes when there's a danger. They're also come and inspect the vessels. So we would have all of those safety concerns run over by the Coast Guard. We would have to follow their rules.
Exactly. Great. Do we have some other questions that we have? Any questions in the room first, or do you want to continue with, we do have some Zoom questions too.
We have 4 Zoom questions if you want to wait for.
I didn't have, excuse me, I'm Frank Klain, my wife Karen, property owners, been property owners since 1997. And I'd like to thank you all and appreciate your efforts in presentation you made this afternoon, this morning, and the presentation you made earlier. I guess my concerns primarily on this was sort of rhetorical, whether they're questions or not, I'm not sure. But from the very beginning, when the issue came up that with general obligation bonds, it would be a tax. People don't like tax. It was a tactic that should never have been used. It was a red herring from the very beginning, and it's still a red herring. If the figures that you just presented recently showed that we actually would be better if we have a revenue shortfall to do a general obligation bond rather than a revenue. Because the revenue, if the Bald Head Island Transportation Authority needs money because there's insufficient funds, they can raise the figures. But then the real nitty gritty comes in. We have minority representation there, which is extremely disadvantageous to us. I'd also, just as sort of as again, I've had concerns as to action on the island with regards to taking positions with regards to this. And I must say, in all candor, I've been very disheartened by the position taken by the Bald Head Association. And you have a different relationship than I necessarily do have with them, but the Bald Head Association in supporting the Developer United's position, I don't think was looking out for the best interests of everyone. They were looking at a more expensive relationship and also a situation in which we as island holders would not have any control. I think those are critical points in this. And I'd like to comment and commend you for addressing these issues in your presentations that you've made, and appreciate all your hard work, and wish you well in proceeding. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
All right, go ahead and read some questions.
Sure, I have 4 of them. I believe all from the same person, Kit Adcock. What guarantee is there with the village ownership that income from the transportation system will be spent exclusively on transportation assets and improvements and not on other village priorities, needs, or functions?
Go ahead. It's Andy Sayre. This would be set up, and Chris, if you could monitor me on this,
Zach.
that this would be an enterprise fund that would, and when you set up these enterprise funds, all the revenues generated by that enterprise fund goes into the enterprise itself. So.
And I would just add, this is Scott, much like our utilities enterprise fund. So what monies that are raised in through our water and sewer bills can't be spent on fixing roads. They only go to the operation of the water and sewer system.
And I would like to add to that too. So every year the village's budget and spending capacity is audited, and municipality budgets work different than your personal budget or a business budget, because not only do you have just general accounting principles, but you also have regulations and statutes that require you to meet certain criteria from state law. We have not had, certainly in the most recent and in prior, have never had any violations of following both state law and accounting purposes. And we do keep those enterprise funds separately. That is part of what we have to do.
And at the end of the day, the village must have a balanced budget. Revenues have to equal the expenses going out. Any additions can be carried over to the new year, as I understand it. Looking at Zach for approval, but at the end of the day, budget needs to balance.
And it does.
And it does balance. All right, next.
All right, this was actually from George Corvin. Much has been said about what could happen if an emergency were to reduce ridership for an extended period of time, such as another pandemic. Has the transportation system experienced a financial crisis during past island emergencies, such as major storms and the pandemic? Does this inform any predictions about the likelihood of needing to use a tax increase to support the system if such an emergency were to occur again?
This is Mike Brown. I mean, I can only say from the analysis that I've seen that from COVID and from Florence, that the transportation system was profitable. There wasn't an instance where the transportation system had to do any kind of equity borrowing or financing or bank loans to continue operations. Obviously, you'd want to set up your cash flows and your reserves, but I have not seen in the 30 years or so of or have heard of any instance where transportation system was in that dire of a situation where the revenues and cash flow from operations sustained its ability to not only pay for itself, but build those reserves and do capital improvements.
I think Mike and Chris can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at one point Limited did petition the Utilities Commission for an increase with increased fuel cost during that period, and then brought those prices back down when that had passed through. But it was for ticket prices. Okay, so we paid it on a ticket on our ferry passes, not from any assessments or digging into another loan or whatever.
Council, just specific to the experiences with Florence, when we
need to get you to a mic.
We managed that recovery process. This is specific to Hurricane Florence. When we managed that recovery process, we essentially took over a ferry and a barge in coordinating with Chad Paul and Bald Head Unlimited for response and recovery efforts to the extent that we were invoiced later. Those invoices were included in a public assistance reimbursement packet through FEMA. So we were actually, I say we, in limited transportation in that specific event scenario, were reimbursed for those costs.
Good point.
So whether it's an authority or the village has ownership, the same would apply.
So not only is there insurance, quote unquote, but there's also different FEMA and grants that could occur.
Correct.
Good.
Another one from Kit Adcock. The last village-funded beach renourishment cost double the previous renourishment. Why do you assume the next one will be the same as 2019, especially with the proposed channel deepening?
Andy. Chris, tell me, I don't think it was double the previous one. I mean, it did go up, and this last one we certainly got
They have averaged on a cubic yard per cost on the volume anywhere from $10 to $12 range, $15 range. So we typically estimate anywhere from 15 to 17 million, maybe on the high end. But there's other variables that come into play with the various dredging contractors that can have an effect on that.
And also the soft tube groins that we have.
Right.
Everyone's.
Yeah, I was going to say, wasn't there some? Didn't we install when did the terminal groin funding happen? Did that have anything to do with what Kit's talking about here in terms of doubling, or is that totally separate?
That was a separate project that coincided with a core dredging project.
Okay.
That we did help fund some of that to place the fillet behind the structure.
Got it. That's right.
But the point in building that jetty was to reduce the erosion.
Right.
And so that we haven't yet probably been there long enough to see, we have seen some improvement already with the jetty there, but that's also a mitigating factor on how much you'd have to spend on beach renourishment.
Right. I would say that the terminal groin structure obviously has had a positive effect. It's well documented in the engineering studies that our coastal engineers performed to the extent that with the latest or the last core project and the amount of the volume of sand that was placed, they were able to start placement further away from the point that traditionally took anywhere from 200 to 300,000 cubic yards just to fill that point on down South Beach. So yes.
All right, the fourth and I believe final question from Kit Adcock. There are no capital improvements listed for resiliency. Sea level rise is occurring. Bald Head Island is an island. This is a real and costly issue that must be addressed. Has the village council considered how such expenses will affect its borrowing needs?
I'll take a first shot at that. If you look at our presentation from August 6th, we talk about some capital improvements necessary, and certainly on the Bald Head Island side where the dock floods during king tides. So part of the $5.5 million that the GO bond would free up gives us the opportunity to make those improvements far sooner than when the Transportation Authority could. So that's just one example, and probably the biggest example specific to sea level rise that we're talking about.
Well, right. The GO bond gives you almost $500,000 every year to try and mitigate and or reserve for these kind of things. And as you learn things, you would obviously put these into the planning. And obviously we're working stormwater management on the island as well. So we're doing multiple things in this regard.
So we all read about island communities and island countries that are having to face this issue of water rising. Certainly, we will look at that. The village, and that occurs with also when Kit was on council, looks long-term at issues. We have we have lots of, I don't say lots of consultants, but we have experts in the field at one of the first village workshop I went to, we had a big presentation on our aquifer system. We've had a, hydrogeologic study that actually looked at, and it's one that you can simulate stuff on. So it looked to see where the water was actually going. And then they were able to dump water in and see how it flowed out, and which is one of the ways that the village made decisions about stormwater management. So of course, it's on everybody's mind. I'm not sure anybody knows how much money to put towards that. I will say also that the village, you're required to have a reserve fund, or suggested that you have a reserve fund by the LGC. And it's about an 8% of your revenue, or
suggested that you have an 8% minimum fund balance.
The 8% minimum fund balance. We have traditionally 2 to 3 times that, and sometimes more. So that's the other question that I've been hearing out there, that you know, what happens if we don't have any money? We have money. We do have some money for emergency situations.
And we also work closely with the Conservancy, talking about, you know, reaching out with partners. I mean, we work with them, and they monitor the aquifers, they monitor the creek and all that kind of activity. And we listen to them in terms of what's their guidance in this whole arena. So
I think it's important to point out, when we use the word conservancy, I mean, when we have our annual report that people come in and report to us, there are people from all over the place that are coming in, and scientists, experts on different fields, and that are associated with the Conservancy. It's not like we're walking down to Conservancy down here and knocking on the door and asking what to do.
Good point.
If you're talking about resiliency and programs, what we've been talking about previous to this is the biggest resilience program that we've. I'm not sure any community, beach community in North Carolina has. Our shoreline stabilization program is a resiliency program. We build that up to protect the houses, the infrastructure. It's what we've been doing for years. So and we're well in tune with trying to figure out what the future will hold.
Good point.
We did receive another one. It's from Sandy Cades. What happens if the GO bond is voted down on November 2nd? What is the backup plan for funding?
Scott, I'll take a stab at that. Well, the backup plan would be a revenue bond if the LGC will give us the opportunity. The fundamental question is, you know, and this will be an LGC decision. It'll be a political decision. Does the voting down of the GO bond send a signal to them that the village, the Bald Head Island community does not want the village running the system? And we're confident that that's going to weigh heavily on their minds. If the GO bond goes down, we think they're going to approve the TA, at which point there is no backup plan on our part. The Transportation Authority will become the owner of the system, and the village will do everything in its power to help the Transportation Authority make that system work and work well. We'll provide as much input. We will meet with them as many times as they want. We'll do what it takes to make sure that their transportation system is a high quality system.
I think also, this is Mike Brown, the village would weigh in because there's still a lot of questions unanswered to the LGC in terms of the valuation. The authority still doesn't have what I would say a valid appraisal. The second appraisal came in, and there's still a lot of questions out there on that. And the LGC has questions. I have not seen any answers to those questions. So there's still kind of a road to hoe, if you will, in terms of getting past the LGC. I think there's a November 2nd meeting, so that's before the election, or on the day of the election, I should say. So no action will be taken then. December 7th is the next LGC meeting. As a village, we would hope that our community supports and votes yes on the GO bond, gives us a seat at the table, and we move on from there. Any other questions?
No, sir.
And any other comments?
We have one.
Oh,
My name is Tom Locke. I'm a resident. And Scott, regarding what you just said, let's flip that over to the other side. There's an election which is going on. The current village is their desire is to go with buying the Transportation Authority. If the election does not go for buying the Transportation Authority, but the GO bond passes, is the new administration beholding to end up having to go forward with that?
In my view, the council, the majority of the council going forward will decide whether to proceed with that proposal or not. They could choose at their first meeting to pull the Bald Head Island proposal to the LGC off the table.
So they're not handcuffed to it.
They're not handcuffed to it. Absolutely not.
But you would think that they would do the right thing.
Well, they're kind of, in my reading, in their campaign, is basically saying that they're not in favor. So if they're going to stay with their campaign and what they're looking for as far as their voters to be voting on, they would end up staying true to their campaign promise, not going forward with it.
But what they would be doing if you pass the GO bond and you have a new group making decisions, you're telling me that the community, the voters, have decided this is the direction we want to go. And then you have 3 people deciding, no, we're not going to do that. And so I think going back to what Andy was saying, there's a level of responsibility. You know, we don't sit on the council for our own benefit. And so the decisions we make are in response to what the community wants.
Great. Any other questions?
No, sir.
Well, again, we appreciate this. I'll turn it over to the mayor for closing today's forum. I thought it was very educational. I appreciate all the input, a lot of questions and answers, a lot of great input. And so I'll say thank you for now.
Yeah, well, I appreciate this. I think this is very well done, put together by the council. And the idea that the Transportation Authority, if the LGC blesses them, that scenario is less than ideal, to say the least. This is a major deal for the island. And ownership, you're talking about ownership that lasts in perpetuity. So I think you got to think about that. Do you really want that ownership outside of the village? And I think it's a very, very logical answer that no, it needs to stay with the users.
Great. Yeah, when you talk about perpetuity, so continuity, you're looking at appointees. I don't know whether the same appointees are going to be there tomorrow. When you're looking at the village owning it, you have the village management that'll be in perpetuity. You know, the council is always going to be changing, but having it tied to the village itself is critical.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Sound like